Hi, welcome to week 8, Sociology, and we're going to be looking at groups and formal organizations. And the first part we'll be looking at is groups. So we're going to formally organize or formally define what are groups, and we'll look at some of the elements about what makes up groups and what are the strengths and weaknesses. And then we're going to spend probably the bulk of this particular week on group dynamics, and in particular we'll look at conformity. We'll look at some of the background of where the research came. It's been a very well-researched topic in groups, both in sociology, social psychology, and psychology. And so it's a really worthwhile topic, and we'll spend some time on it and what the results would be and what the implications of conformity is and why do we do that. Okay? The second part of this chapter on formal organizations will be taken care of in next week, week 9. Alright, have your textbooks ready and be able to make notes, because that's the best way, of course, to be prepared for tests, to have all your work prepared. And it's good to do that in front of these videos to get a sense about what kind of content will be covered on the tests. Thank you very much and good luck.
All right, let's start with the components of structure. And what we're going to start with is groups. Now, a group is a social group consists of 2 or more people who interact frequently, and they share a common identity and feeling of interdependence. Now, interdependence isn't dependent or independent. Interdependence means they rely on one another. So groups then are that sort of dynamic, okay? Now, groups can be divided into 2. There's primary groups, and these are a small group whose members engage in face-to-face interaction. They're emotional based, and these interactions are emotion based, and over an extended period of time, not just for a week, and not just for a month, but for years. And so we would often view our family and close friends and sometimes our work peer groups as being a part of our primary group. And we may be part of more than one primary group, but any group in which you interact with them face to face, do so on an emotional based interaction. You care about them, you have feelings for them, and it's done over a long period of time. That would be considered a primary group. Now, a secondary group, by contrast, this is a larger group. They're more specialized. Unlike your family that's not very specialized, we do a lot of different things together. Secondary groups are much more specialized. They do limited things. They do a very good job at these limited things, or they do very specific things. And these members may not be as personally connected. In fact, the term impersonal is often introduced when it comes to secondary groups. They're impersonal, they're goal-oriented relationships. We work together towards a similar goal. I don't have to be your best friend, I don't even have to like you, but we work together towards the same goal. And we do so for a limited period of time, between 9 and 5 during the day, during Monday to Friday. I don't see you on the weekends. And after a period of time on this contract with you, I may not see you again until another contract where I'm involved with you again. So secondary groups are larger, more specialized, less personal, more goal-oriented, in a shorter period of time. So our school settings are oftentimes secondary groups, although you may have a primary group in there. Your churches, the military, corporations, businesses are oftentimes secondary groups. Now, we also have what we would call a network or a web of social relationships that link one person to other people, and through them additional people. So I'm not just connected to you on my social network, I'm also connected to other people through you. Now, we're going to get into formal organizations in the next week, but I just want to introduce within the components of social structure. We have primary, secondary groups, we also have these networks, and we have formal organizations, which are highly structured secondary groups formed for the purposes of achieving specific goals in the most efficient manner possible. So we find corporations, schools, and government agencies falling in here. Now, what we're going to focus more on this time around will be our social groups. So we're going to begin with, looking at this relates to mostly the primary and secondary groups, and all groups set boundaries that distinguish, us from them. Distinguish between those who belong in and those who do not. So we'll have sometimes formal boundaries that would be set, sort of like, here's the people, you have a fitness membership, you get to be involved in this club because you've paid for a membership. Or you have informal boundaries, which would be your friendships. And essentially boundaries, these in-group and out-group set of boundaries, are intended to create a belongingness, or a sense of inclusion. And so when we think in terms of out-groups, when you're not a part of a group. And so the out-group would be those times when you feel disconnected, not a part of things. And so these are where the boundaries can promote racism, or they can promote sexism, ageism, and a sense of ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is where we see our own group, our own sense of who we are as being superior to any other group. Now, the in-group, of course, when you've been on the in-group, whether it's because you've participated in membership drives and you've paid your membership, or you've got friends, or maybe you've celebrated a team win and you've been among other people who are celebrating and cheering for the same team. That makes you a part of that group. And some of these in-groups can last for very long times. You can be friends with people for long periods of time over long time frames. Now, when we have in-groups and out-groups, we have this sense of inclusion and exclusion. You're included in the in-group, you're excluded from the out-group. Now, part of how we define our social groups and determine our social groups is through something that's called a reference group. Reference groups are groups that strongly influence a person's behavior and social attitudes, regardless of whether the individual, that is you or I, are a member of these particular groups. A reference group helps us explain why our behavior and attitudes sometimes differ from those of other membership groups. We may accept that the values and the norms of a group with which we identify with rather than ones in which we belong. So when we look at reference groups, these are things that either we strive to be or we identify with, and we see ourselves being part of, or in the in-group, if you will. They may stand out as being aspirations where we want to see ourselves being somewhere in the near future, perhaps. Now, when I mentioned earlier about networks, a network is this social web relationship that links a person and people through them to additional people. It's a Small World is the movie that references this whole notion about the connectivity of a social network. Research has shown that networks play a very important role in graduating students finding employment. Not just who I know, but who you know, and who you know can connect me to somebody who has a job that I might be a fit for. Stanley Milgram's study found that it took an average of 5 contacts to get letters sent to intended recipients. So what he did was Stanley Milgram gave you a letter and said, I need you to get it to this person, and you needed to give it to one more person, who would then in turn give it to somebody else, who would then in turn give it to somebody else, where he was measuring how many times did that letter need to get passed between people to get to the intended person. It couldn't go into the mail. It needed to be given to a person. And on average, 5 times did that letter change hands to get to the intended person, no matter where they were in the world. The research was popularized in a movie called 6 Degrees of Separation, and there's a popular trivial game, and you may have heard of it, called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where it looks at how many relationships from where you are to this other person, in this case Kevin Bacon, can you see yourself connected to him. Now, in this relationship of social groups, there's a very important element about group characteristics and dynamics that has been studied quite extensively, and that is around group conformity. And the term group conformity, or conformity, is a process of maintaining or changing behaviors to comply with the norms established by a society, a subculture, or other group. And so we have a tendency in terms of doing this, the theory is that we tend to be significantly influenced by others in our group to the extent that we may deny our own senses, our own loyalties, and our commitment to the truth. Now, I know most of us would say we wouldn't do that, and yet it's surprising to the degree of which conformity is important to us. The need to emphasize the connection of conformity and personal awareness of one's own values and beliefs. As a method, there is a video that I was going to post for you, but I decided not to. It's done by Philip Zimbardo. You can find it on TED, where it looks at the choices that people make in terms of, doing good things or doing bad things. And I believe the video, that if you want to check it out yourself, is about being heroes or the monsters within us. I've forgotten exactly the title of it, but it can be found if you search for Philip Zimbardo. It's on TED. And so when we think about conformity and our need to do so, it's a very interesting topic. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through, and I'll post the videos of both Solomon Asch and Stanley Milgram. Asch's experiment looked at conformity, where what he did is he had participants that were willing to, found that participants were willing to contradict their own best judgment if it fit the rest of the group. If it meant that the rest of the group was going to disagree with them, they would alter their own point of view and change their mind based on what the group wanted. And what he would do in his experiment would show these lines, as you see here, and there's the comparison lines and the standard line. And the point would be which of these three comparison lines matches the standard line. And the image you see on the right, you see 6 participants, although 5 of them are Confederates. 5 of them are a part of the experiment. And so they would each select maybe 1 or 3 as the match to the standard line. But the 6th person, who didn't know that everybody else was in on the experiment, would understand number 2 fit the standard line. And quite at a very high rate, the number of people that would match what the group said, even though they knew they were right, they would give up their rightness to match the group. And that study was quite instrumental in looking at this phenomenon of group conformity. Now, Stanley Milgram's experiment that he did, he found that participants were willing to do something, in this case giving electric shocks, because the authority figure told them to do it. When the experimenter indicated that the teacher should be given increasingly painful shocks, 65% of them administered the shocks all the way to the XXX on the machine, which was 450 volts, which is quite significant. In fact, in some cases that would be extremely serious to one's health. So what can we learn from the Milgram study? Well, the study provides evidence that obedience to authority may be more common than most people would like to believe. Now, I'm going to post both the videos of Asch's experiment and Milgram's experiment for you to view, to get a handle on just the significance of group dynamics and the role that others play in what we may or may not do in terms of conformity. Now, the image on the bottom right is you're seeing the electric shock switch machine and the person in teacher, the teacher there. They're asking a bunch of questions to the person who's connected to this chair that's got electric shock related to it. Now, the person in the chair is not really connected to it, and in fact is in a separate room, and they are part of the experiment as well. And then the experimenter, who is the authority, generally has a white coat and a clipboard. As this person continues to say the words and expects the correct response, when the response is incorrect, he's to give an increasing shock each time it's wrong. When he gets to a point where he kind of questions whether I should do this anymore, the authority figure says, no, carry on, it's my responsibility, you just carry on, do as I ask. 65% of the people would go all the way up to 450 volts. It's quite amazing. Okay, so what we've done here, we've looked at the initial portion of this chapter, looking at groups, social groups, and group dynamics. The next video that we'll do in week 9 will look at formal organizations. Good luck, everybody, and enjoy your day.